So hi everyone. For our weekly Torah learning, what we're going to be doing is Ethics of Our Fathers. These are teachings that we learn between Passover and Shavuot. And the interesting thing about ethics is that it's not law, and the difference between an ethic and a law is that law you can mandate. So let's say it's a law, don't steal, don't take someone else's property. If someone does take your property, then you can take them to court and you can litigate against the person who has infracted that law. But when it comes to ethics, it's not something that we can mandate. For example, greet everyone cheerfully. What are you going to do if you have a neighbor who doesn't want to say hello to you? Well, it may not be comfortable, but there's not much that you can do about it. Now, I have done webinars on Ethics of Our Fathers in the past, and what we did is look at a very deep analysis of these teachings. And what I thought we'd do for this run is take really simple ones. You know, sometimes less is more, or we have to get back to basics. Just talking about a couple of teachings that have to do with interpersonal relationships, attitudes towards our life today. There'll even be something in terms of an attitude towards governing bodies, and taking it in a really simple way. So as always, our learning is in honor of Nicola Bat Moshe. She's the person actually that our weekly learning began in honor of, as well as Sarah Razel, Bat Ethel, Ethel Chana, Shlomo Yitzchak ben Moshe, and Yitzchak ben Shimon. Our first teaching, or this week we're doing chapter 3, is from the first Mishnah, and it was taught to us by Akavya, the son of Mahalalel. He said, reflect upon 3 things and you will not come to the hands of transgression. Doesn't just say you won't come to transgress anything, but even to the hands of transgression. You'll be even more protected from committing a wrong. And what are those 3 things? Know where you came from, where you are going, and before whom you are destined to give a judgment and accounting. From where you came, from a putrid drop. Where are you going? To a place of dust, maggots, and worms. And before whom you are destined to give a judgment and accounting, before the Supreme King of Kings, the Holy One, blessed be He. Now, there is a teaching that I shared previously that they are actually 2 separate teachings over here. The one is reflect upon 3 things and you won't come to the hands of transgression. The second is know these 3 things, where you came from, where you're going, before whom you're destined to give an accounting. The idea there is that when you reflect upon 3 things, our approach to life in general should be there's me, there's the world, and there is God. If we don't have that umbrella of our Creator, and we just try and connect with others and ourselves without having that 3rd dimension, the dimension of holiness, we can't heal. We find ourselves going down dead ends. One of the ways that I speak about this in the method is thinking about relationships in terms of a graph. So you have the y-axis and the x-axis. The horizontal x-axis would be your interpersonal relationships with others, and that's what we call humanism. And it could be you and others, you and your parents, your kids, your friends, colleagues, teachers, students, the boss, an employee, etc. You have all of those, but if you're not focused on the y-axis, which incorporates, there's 2 dimensions to that y-axis, but if you're not focused on bringing that vertical dimension that has divinity, that it's addressing divinity, bringing God into our lives, then our interpersonal humanistic relationships will be very limited and unsatisfying. But it's not as significant that they'll be unsatisfying as that they will be limited. They're not going to embody the full potential of what they can vis-a-vis serving God. So that's just another idea that I thought I would bring in. But at the simple level, what Rabbi Akavia is saying is think about three things and you won't come to the hands of the transgression. And what are those things? Meditate upon your origin, your destination, and what's going to happen when you transition and move out of the body to the next dimension. And I think that these things at some level might bring people to be depressed. Like, how is it going to help me? Where did I come from a putrid drop? And where am I going to the grave and decomposition, really? My teacher, Rabbi Kesselman, always stressed the verse from Genesis that on the sixth day, when God finished creating what he did, he observed his creation and said that it was very good. And the Midrash says, why does God say that it was very good? The other days we're just told that it was good. On the second day we're told it was good twice, and Rashi explains there what the reason is. Midrash is commenting, why do we say it was very good? And it comments, very good refers to the angel of death, or in Hebrew, Tov Ma'od U'Malach HaMoves. Very good is the angel of death. And the simple understanding there is that death gives value to life. The fact that something comes to an end makes us appreciate it more. And we see it as we age. The closer we are to the end of our life, the more precious each day comes from. And so I think that the notion of the frailty of our physical existence and the temporality, it's something that doesn't last, is something that really opens us up to the full value of that moment. Where did I come from? A putrid drop. We have delusions of grandeur. Now, I think that we break ourselves where we should be celebrating our greatness, and we aggrandize ourselves when we are afraid of our frailty or insecure. And here's something really simple. There's that moment of conception. That's where I come from. It's not anything grand. And when we're able to accept our frailty, we show up so much better. I'm finding with my clients on an ongoing basis that perfectionism, Tov Ma'od U'Malach HaMoves, very good as an angel of death, really can be understood as an insistence on perfection, an insistence on very good as an angel of death. But if I come at my life and say, well, I have a soul that is invested in this body that comes from that seminal drop and is going to decay, then everything in between shifts my perspective. We have a more gentle approach to ourselves, and then our godly soul can shine. There's a beautiful prayer in the morning blessings where we say to God, the soul that you've given me is pure. You created it, you formed it, and breathed it into me. And those words in Hebrew are actually referencing the journey of the soul into the body, as we've discussed in our Tanya classes. God is bringing our soul down, helping it become able to be invested in a physical body. And then we say, and in the future you're going to take it from me, which is death, and then you'll return it to me, resurrection of the dead. And then the prayer says, as long as my soul is within me, I'm going to serve you. I'm going to give back to you who have given me life. And the teaching of it there is, because it comes from you and is destined to return to you, I see how temporary my life is, So that gives value to my life, and in that moment, it all belongs to you. I come from you, I'm going back to you. In this moment, I am yours. And then I think this idea of being accountable, destined to give a judgment and accounting, and it's not just before the IRS or some legal court, it's before the King of Kings, the Holy One, blessed be He. As I always say, I think judgment has a very bad rap. So does punishment. It's really important to be judgmental, because if you're not judgmental, if you don't make judgments, you won't establish boundaries. You'll allow other people to take advantage of you, or you're going to take advantage of others. And if you don't punish, if there aren't consequences for wrong, bad behavior, then you are betraying the people under your charge. Now, I'm not saying that we must go out. Punishment is not vengeance. In fact, there is a prohibition against vengeance in the Torah. Le sikim v'le sitter. We are in the Torah portion of Kedoshim, which we just had. We are forbidden from taking revenge, kind of taking punishment into our own hands, and not only that, we are forbidden from bearing a grudge. Natira is, let's say, someone. Rashi gives an interesting example there. Let's say someone comes and says, "Can I borrow your vacuum cleaner?" Or you go to your friend and you say, "Can I borrow your vacuum cleaner?" And they say, "No." And then they come to you and say, "Can I borrow your computer?" And you say, "No, you didn't lend me the vacuum cleaner, so I'm not giving you the computer." That's called revenge. Getting back at someone. Natira would be the girl comes to ask me to borrow the computer, and I say, "Yeah, I'll give you the computer. I'm not like you who doesn't lend her vacuum cleaner out," right? It's kind of you're holding onto something inside. So these things are prohibited, but that's not the same as punishment. Schar and einish, reward and punishment, is one of the 13 principles of faith that are outlined by the Rambam, and it goes together with making judgments. Punishment means there is going to be a judgment. And what I think happens is that we very much want a relationship. Take a teacher-student relationship, for example. So the teacher wants a relationship with her kids, and she wants the students to like her, and so she will withhold enforcing a rule. Now, there are times where the more appropriate educational aspect is to treat someone with empathy, understand where they come from, why this happened, etc. But very often we are withholding punishment, not because we care about the other, but because we care about ourselves. We want them to like us. So I really, encourage us to think about the value of enforcing boundaries and the value of making judgments. Because if we don't, we are definitely the tree of life. You can't be overly balanced to the side of loving kindness and inclusivity. We have to balance the left and the right. And then to think about our own lives. Right now, I might want that temporary pleasure, but what's going to happen down the line? I think that much of the pain that is described in terms of the next world is the sense of loss that we have. Gosh, I gave in, I did something that was pleasurable in the moment, but betrayed my soul and betrayed my Creator. Okay, so that is a teaching from Mishnah 1. Number 2, which I think is something that might be very triggering in our day and age, is a teaching from the second Mishnah, Rabbi Hanina. He was the Sgan HaKohanim, the deputy to the priests. And he taught, pray for the integrity of the government, for were it not for the fear of its authority, a man would swallow his neighbor alive. Now, in a previous lesson, I had spoken about this in terms of the deep mystical teaching embedded here, because as I said at the outset, there are always the two levels to read these ethics. The one is just about basic interpersonal dynamics, and the other one is describing optimal ways of being in terms of aligning our body and our soul. At that level, what we're speaking about is government is malchut in Hebrew, and malchut is connected with the attribute in our soul of mastery. Now, interestingly, you can speak about malchut, and you can also speak about memshalah. Memshalah is like top-down governing, and malchut is bottom-up governing. So at some level, what we're saying here is pray for integrity in your self-mastery, and pray for a sense of being in the presence of malchut, of Maila, of God's presence, of God's governance of the world. Because if we didn't have a sense of a higher power, our ego would literally swallow another person up. That's the deep idea here. It's not saying that if they weren't for fear of the government, we'd kill each other. God forbid. It's saying that we would swallow each other. And the idea of swallowing another person is you no longer exist unto yourself, for yourself. You have to be appropriated by me, absorbed into my reality. So that's a very beautiful psychological and spiritual reading of this. But I think that there's something else here. It's not saying pray for the government. You're actually praying for integrity, for the peace of the government. Pray that our leaders will be full of integrity and honestly seeking peace, not taking bribes and not being led by donations, but really a higher sense of serving the community, the city, the country, etc. And then the Mishnah tells us something. We may not like this, but it's true that if there wasn't an authority over us, at some level, people will revert to being animalistic. What was that book? I can't remember. You can send it to me in the chat if you do, about boys who were stranded on an island, and how there's one who tries to keep integrity, and then there are others who are grabbing power. And I think that we live in a world that stresses utopianism, that we're striving, and not only striving towards a utopia, but that is the way people are. I know that readers were upset by a blog that I posted saying, I think that the Me Too woman has a tendency, of course, we have to stand up against abuse of all kinds, and sexual abuse certainly, but to say that a woman is never accountable for what's going on, very problematic. That comes from utopianism, which is to say, if you dress up in a way that is very sexual, when you sexualize yourself and present yourself as an object, you're objectifying yourself and wanting looks and approval from someone else. And then a man responds to that. Well, you have a part in that, right? There's an element of utopianism to say we are never responsible. Even if the responsibility that I bear is 1% or 0.5%, I make the world better by owning what is mine, and equally difficult not owning what is not mine. So I'm speaking here about that utopianism as being damaging to life. If we think that no one is or that all people are able to live in peace, we're deluding ourselves, because all of us have a shadow self. There's the godly soul and there's the animal soul, and they're both active inside the body all the time, and that's where much of our conflict arises, or that's where all of our conflict arises from. But what Rabbi Hanina is saying over here is that there is this shadow self, there is an egoistic part to ourself, and that if it weren't for an external authority, then we would violate our neighbors. Okie doke. So now the next one. This is from Mishnah 7, and I'm not going to speak extensively about it. Rabbi Elazar bar Toza said, "Give him what is his for you, and whatever is yours are his." As David says, "For everything comes from you, and from your own hand we give to you." And I think there's something so liberating about that as well. Very simple, but deeply liberating. My kids used to complain if I confiscated something, and I made it very clear to them that whatever they owned was actually my possession. Not saying that I own my children. God, they are God's children, and I am responsible for educating them. But like having it clear, and when it comes to us as well, am I really giving to God because I'm giving 10% to charity? Nope. The idea is everything that I own is God's. As we are taught, the gold and the silver and the gold are mine. So all the wealth in the world belongs to God. He apportions some of his wealth to us, and then we give back 10% as a minimum tithe to God. And I think that applies not just at the material level, but when we're looking at who we are as a person. What are your gifts? Are you a writer? Are you an artist? Are you a particularly kind and loving person? Whatever our spiritual attributes are and our creative talents are, it's not something that we created. It's something that was given to us, embedded within the soul from our Creator. And therefore, in every moment, what I want to do is take that and give it back to Him. I once heard a beautiful teaching by Rabbi Yitzhak Ginsburg. His website is inner.org. And he said we have to think of ourselves, our body, as an altar. And just as things were brought up onto the altar and consumed and the smoke rose up to God, that is the way we have to function. So I become a living altar with the sacrifices, the offerings that are rising up to my Creator. And very liberating to say, I can only be what God made me. I feeling I'm too much of a harsh person, I'm too severe, and I worked a lot on myself to balance that. But I have also come to accept I am a person who is connected to the left side of the tree and boundaries, and let me serve my Creator with those attributes rather than simply trying to suppress them and become something that I'm not. As one of the Methodisms says, don't become new, become you. Our work is not to become something different, but to be who we truly are. Next is another beautiful, simple, interpersonal teaching from Mishnah 10. Rabbi Hanina, the son of Dosa, said, one who is pleasing to his fellow is pleasing to God, but one who is not pleasing to his fellow man is not pleasing to God. And very often we hear these complaints about, if I can just say as an aside, people will say, oh, I don't want to be religious because I know religious people who aren't pleasing to God. Yeah, that is absolutely true. Our ideal is that we should be pleasing to God. I just want to mention as an aside, I don't hear people say, I don't want to be rich because I know some rich people who are crooks, or I don't want to be popular, because I know some popular people that are not nice people, etc. So there's a certain kind of intellectual dishonesty in that statement, just as an aside to bear in mind. At the same time, we have to realize that our work is not just about interpersonal relationships. It's taking us back to what I mentioned about the X and Y axis at the very beginning. If we are not in alignment with what God wants, then anything that we have interpersonally isn't pleasing to God. We are taught about Queen Esther, that she found favor in the eyes of all who saw her. And my teacher, Robertson Heller, said Esther had something in her of each of the 70 nations of the world. And so when they looked at her, and she was so self-effacing that those qualities and attributes shone forth, but without dominating the other. So, if you were a Brit and you looked at Esther, you'd say she was British, and if you were an American and met her, you'd say she's as American as apple pie, and so if you were South African, Moroccan, etc. Everyone recognized in her something of themselves that she reflected back at them. It's a beautiful example of what it meant to be pleasing to one's fellow. But Robertson Heller gave another teaching about Queen Esther, where she said, we're told when the beginning of her life is being described, that she was married to her cousin Mordecai. We're told she had no father and mother, and the commentators tell us that her father passed away before she was born, and her mother in childbirth. She was doubly orphaned from the moment she was born, and she could have developed some really intense defense mechanisms. But what she did instead is surrender her well-being to God. That was where the nexus of her greatness was, that loss that she had experienced. And not having anything, she was able to let go and let God. And I think that those two teachings of Robertson Heller on the Megillah are connected, that much of her pleasantness, the way that she found grace in the eyes of others, was due to her self-effacement, and the self-effacement was connected to her being doubly orphaned and surrendering to her Creator. Next, Mishnah 13, and this is from Rabbi Akiva. Also, I think what I chose for today are things that I think are a little countercultural and not so comfortable necessarily for us coming from a Western mindset. Jesting and frivolity accustom a person to promiscuity. Tradition is a safety fence to Torah. Tithing a safety fence to wealth. Vows a safety fence for abstinence. A safety fence for wisdom is silence. So let's just go through that. When we say jesting and frivolity accustom a person to promiscuity, not saying joy or happiness brings a person to promiscuity. It's describing a particular kind of interaction. And if you look in the abridged version of the Code of Jewish Law, there's an interesting chapter called attributes that a person should accustom themselves to walk in, to pursue, to acquire. And one of the things that is discussed right at the beginning is that there is a spectrum and a range in every emotion, from one extreme to the other, and we should strive for the middle path, except when it comes to two things: to be extremely humble and extremely slow to anger. Be extremely humble in front of every person, and that's actually another teaching from Ethics of Our Fathers. So in those two respects, we want to go to extremes, but in everything else, we should strive for the middle ground. And one of the examples that is given there is monetary. For example, there's a person who's very stingy. And often when I ask people, what's the opposite of stinginess? They'll say charitability, that someone is comfortable to give charity as the opposite of being stingy. But the code does not say that. The code says the opposite of stinginess is to be a spendthrift. You can't hold on to the money. So one person can't let go of it, one person can't hold on to it. And the middle path is to be charitable. And then it brings another example. I can't remember which comes first. That there's a person who's particularly morose, and what's the opposite of that? Our tendency is to say the opposite of that attribute is to be joyous. But the codifier says no, the opposite of a depressive, morose nature is to be frivolous, and what we have to aspire to is the middle path, and that is simcha, joy. So joy is like a balanced central point. Here, the Mishnah, Rabbi Akiva, is telling us there's something problematic with frivolity. It's making light of everything and jesting, making light. One of the most difficult interactions, uncomfortable interactions to counteract is sarcasm. Because when you say something to someone who is sarcastic, they're very likely to say, nah, I don't know what you're making a big deal about. I was just joking. No, there's a lot of passive aggression that is embedded inside the sarcasm. And here the point is made that if we are continuously involved in making nothing out of something, undermining the value or the importance of something, it can bring us to promiscuity. Taking boundaries with others too lightly. And at the most basic level, you think of office parties or people drinking and becoming intoxicated, and then there's a lot of frivolity that happens, and that brings us to promiscuity. Tradition is a safety fence to Torah, is speaking about the fact that there's certain aspects of our lives that are not law. It's a tradition that has been passed down to us, but we don't violate that because it serves as a fence to the central body of Torah. And similarly, if a person wants to become wealthy, they should tithe. There's actually in Hebrew a connection between those words. So Meiser is a tithe, and it comes from the word eser, which is 10, that you're giving a tenth, but it's connected to the word ashir, which is wealth. If you want to become wealthy, then make sure that you're going to give that tithe. Vows are safety fence for abstinence. Last night in the method I was speaking about addiction, and shared that so many people kind of are making vows that they're never going to do it again, and then they stumble. And that's where the first step of the 12 steps comes in, admitting that we're powerless over the substance, not over it doesn't mean when someone says I'm powerless over alcohol that they accept the fact that they now will just drink because they're powerless. It means I am powerless over that substance. And but I do have a way of dealing with my alcoholism. Because I'm an alcoholic, I'm powerless over the substance and I can never pick it up. So in that respect, we're not talking about vows in that sense, but in one's regular life, we're not encouraged to take too many vows, but it's like a promise, a commitment to oneself. In Hasidus, we call it kabur b'nefesh, established, firm in the soul. Like a doctor tells you don't do X, Y, Z, and you believe the doctor, so you don't do it. But when it comes to a spiritual teaching, we don't necessarily do that. Or the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe speaks about a person waking up in the morning and without fail reading the New York Times. You have a cup of coffee in the New York Times, and that's something that is kabur b'nefesh, like that's established in your day. What we want to work towards is finding these fences within ourselves so that we learn to master ourselves and stay away from indulging. A lot of what we taught is that indulging is what we should do, what we're entitled to, but that never creates the life that we want or that we are asked to live. And the last point here is a safety fence for wisdom is silence. It's interesting to me that the word silence comes at the end, both in the English translation and the Hebrew. So, rather than this is a safety fence for that, here it says a safety fence for that is this, that the silence is quiet and comes at the end. If we want to become truly wise, we have to listen. And in interpersonal relationships, one of my lines is the conversation begins in silence. Most times if we think we're having a dialogue, it's a concurrent monologue. I speak and I want you to accept what I'm saying, and then when you speak, I'm not really absorbing what you're saying, I'm planning my rebuttal. And while I'm speaking, you're planning the same thing. So we're just talking and stopping and talking and stopping, but it's not really a dialogue. And it's difficult for us to be quiet because maybe we have to throw out some of our old ideas, admit that we were wrong in our framing or perception of something. So silence, if we can be silent, not just with our mouth, but on the inside, we're able to grow and extend our wisdom. The next Mishnah is Mishnah 15, and it says, Rabbi Akiva as well says here, all is foreseen and freedom of choice is granted. The world is judged with goodness, but in accordance with the amount of man's positive deeds. And we have to live with that contradiction, that God knows everything, and yet I have freedom of choice. I'm not going into the deep philosophical resolution of that, but we do have to know God is beyond time and I live within time. So when we say God's name, Havaya, the four-letter tetragrammaton, it's from Haya, Hoibe, and Yeh, was, is, and will be. So God is the container who transcends all time, sees everything, and yet in this mysterious, remarkable way has given us freedom of choice. And ultimately that's all we have. As we're taught, everything is in the hands of heaven other than the fear of heaven, or the reverence of heaven. I can't choose what happens to me. I choose the way I respond to what happens to me. We don't choose you choose whom you're going to marry. But at the same time, we're told, what's God been doing since he created the world? He's been putting souls together. At some level, we recognize whom we're going to marry, and then we choose to do that. That's not really free choice. It's like recognizing what is yours and taking it. At the very core, freedom of choice means deciding between two identical things or apparently identical things. And so often when we have to make our decisions are always ultimately in moral dimensions. What does God want of me in this situation, as opposed to, of course we have to get up and go to work, but we don't choose, will I be wealthy, will I not? We may want to, but we don't determine it. We are not the determinants of that. Our freedom of choice is in the arena of reverence of heaven. And then the last teaching for today is, if there is no Torah, there's no common decency. If there's no common decency, there is no Torah. If there's no wisdom, there's no fear of God. And if there's no fear of God, there is no wisdom. If there's no applied knowledge, no analytical knowledge. And if there's no analytical knowledge, no applied knowledge. I took that translation from Chabad.org. I actually think that it should be reversed there, and I'll explain it. If there's no flower, there is no Torah. If there is no Torah, there is no flower. The first one takes us back to what we were saying about, what pleases God. It can't just be if you're not pleasing to others, that God finds favor in you. Although it's very difficult to, often one has to be a whistleblower to call it as it is. There could be things going wrong. If you're speaking truth, there will be people who are unhappy to you. I don't think that that's what the Mishnah is talking about. It's talking about this here, being decent to other people. And what I find particularly interesting is that term common decency in Hebrew is derech eretz. Without Torah, you can't have derech eretz. That same idea of, if not for the fear of the government, we would swallow each other alive. We would swallow our neighbor. It's not a stranger alive. Our ego would take over because we're not living in a utopian reality. And it is the umbrella, the overarching truths of the Torah that allow us to treat each other with simple, common respect. When you look at the world today, the notion that I don't agree with you can allow me to assault you, to take your property, to damage your property, etc., is happening because there isn't the wholeness of government and the wholeness of supernal government, and the notion that there is a higher power and a higher law that I have to align myself with. So when we knock the Torah out, we can't have common decency. I know that Dennis Prager put out a book on the Ten Commandments, something, I haven't read it and I do want to, but the premise was, even if you don't believe in God, these 10 commandments are still the best mandate, way, plan or design for a society to function. And I think that that is a very dangerous idea, because once you take God out of the 10 commandments, well, there's no Torah. Not only will there be no 10 commandments, if there's no God, there's no 10 commandments. There's not even common decency. The corollary of that is, if there's no common decency, if we don't treat each other properly, then it's impossible that we are living Torah as it is supposed to be. The interrelationship of wisdom and fear is that if you don't, wisdom isn't just knowledge. Like when you say a person is wise, they have an amorphous sense of truth as well, and that wisdom is an interface or a segue to reverence of God. The more wisdom we have, the more reverence we have. Like a person who is not involved at all in the wisdom of Torah cannot have a full-fledged relationship of God. And you can see it also in the way we relate to each other. The more you have a sense of the other person, the more respect there is for that person. Certainly applies with our Creator. But the corollary is also true. If there isn't fear or reverence of God, fear can be understood as fear of punishment, but it can also be the higher level of fear. It's like being humble and embarrassed almost in the greatness of the other, in this case our Creator. If we don't have that, it's impossible for us to have real wisdom, because wisdom is linked with the humility that is bound with fear. I've met professors who are very knowledgeable on their topic, but they're not wise, and they're not wise because they don't have the humility that is associated with reverence. The idea of applied knowledge, my understanding is that it's da'as. I often describe it as internalizing knowledge, and analytical knowledge would be bina, which is analyzing, breaking down an idea. And if you want to internalize information, you have to analyze it and become intimate with it. And the corollary there is also true. I just want to close before we come to questions with the idea of ein kemach, ein Torah. If there's no flour, there's no Torah, and the reverse as well. What that means is that to support institutions and even the observance of the commandments, there has to be money. The flour is about money that provides for it. And at the same time, if there isn't Torah, then our financial interactions become corrupted, compromised, and disappear. Today, I think people look at it. Doesn't use the word money for a reason, but we're taking it here in that at that reading. There's this notion that money corrupts and money is bad. Well, money is essential. The previous Lubavitcher Rebbe says to someone who writes to a follower of his, and I think he was fundraising, he was asking him to make a donation, and he says, money is manure. And what he describes there is that manure is one of the lowest physical substances, but using compost, biodegraded matter, is one of the most effective ways of generating growth. And he says the same when it comes to money. It's a lowly thing, and it could be very smelly. There's a lot that is associated with money that might be distasteful to us. But in essence, I'm not talking about using money that has come by theft, because there's a teaching, ein mitzvah sheba ba'avera, there's no good deed that can be performed if it's come about through a transgression. You can't steal money and give it to charity or use it in the service of God. That is a principle. It wouldn't be considered to have been a positive thing at all. But despite all this that is associated with money, that which we come across, the money that we earn by our own effort, is there to support Torah. And the Frierdiker Rebbe says this is like manure, causing something to grow. All right, everyone. So those are our teachings from today. And what I'm going to do right now is put the microphone on pause and just see if anyone has any questions. Okay, all. Thank you again for joining us. As always, our learning is in honor of Michal Bas Moshe, Sarah Rezel Bas Hannah, Shlomo Yitzchak ben Moshe, and Yitzchak ben Shimon. It was great connecting with you, and I look forward to seeing you next time. Bye-bye.